This public hearing by the Committee on Appropriations and Adjudication will now come to order. Notice of the public hearing was disseminated to all local media outlets via electronic format on February the 22nd, with a second notice provided on February the 27th. Notice of the hearing was also made known on the Guam Legislature's website. We have one bill on this afternoon's agenda, and that is a bill introduced by Senator Nicolas, Bill 266, and I'll have him read the title when he does his opening statement. And we have a number of people. I'm very happy to see that we have a large turnout. We will continue this hearing through the rest of the afternoon, and if there are other employees that want to come, the committee will be willing to stay until after 5 to hear all the testimony. This is a very important issue. It involves the retirement of over 8,000 employees of the government of Guam who are currently in the DC plan, and it will affect the retirement of future employees of the government of Guam. So I'm hoping that we'll get a good cross-section and a good number of people to testify, and the committee will stay in session as long as is necessary to hear all the testimony that we hope that we will receive this afternoon. And with that, I will turn the mic over to the sponsor of this legislation, Senator Nicolas. I don't know if he's going to read the entire title or just explain the bill that he has introduced.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You mentioned the title twice, so I guess I have to read it. This is Bill 266-33, an act to amend 4 GCA subsections 8208 and 8209 to amend the new subsection 8507, which is added to 4 GCA by Section 3 of Bill number 2-33, and to add a new Article 6 to Chapter 8, Title 4, Guam Code Annotated, relative to creating a new retirement plan once employees become eligible for Social Security, old age, survivors, and disability insurance, providing for a cash balance retirement plan with benefits at least equivalent to Social Security OASDI, providing matched employee contribution rates of 6 2/10% for the defined contribution plan and Guam Retirement Security Plan, providing for an employee contribution rate of 6 2/10% for the hybrid retirement plan, creating mandatory employee contribution rates of 1% to the Deferred Compensation Program for the new retirement plan once employees become eligible for Social Security OASDI, defined contribution plan, hybrid retirement plan, and Guam Retirement Security Plan, and providing for the reamortization of the actuarially accrued unfunded liability of the defined benefit plan. I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and the committee for having this hearing. And the title, as long as it is, kind of encapsulates the unique nature of this bill, as it is introduced with the intent of providing specific sections of compromise to what has already been introduced as Bill number 2-33, the original hybrid proposal that your committee and the Government of Guam Retirement Fund have been working on diligently for quite some time. The original proposal in Bill 2, the hybrid retirement system, seeks to reform the existing defined contribution plan and limit it entirely to the hybrid concept that's been in discussions with the committee, the people of Guam for many months now. And what we have come to determine in the course of these discussions is that the various stakeholders and the various contributing parties to the discussions have expressed areas that they support within the original hybrid proposal and also areas that are of concern. Namely, what's of concern is the topic of revenue neutrality that the original hybrid proposal is intending to address. Originally, revenue neutrality was the question of how we're going to be able to go about paying for the hybrid plan. And the original proposal in Bill 2 has a hybrid proposal that would predominantly be funded by increasing the amounts that the employees have to pay while decreasing the amounts that the government is going to contribute, and having it all balanced out with an additional government supplement to pay for the unfunded portions of adopting the hybrid proposal. The financing mechanism that would entail for the budget of the government of Guam would require little to any additional appropriations from what the current appropriation levels are. And that was what was originally the intent of securing a revenue-neutral retirement proposal or as a plan to replace the defined contribution plan. The issue of revenue neutrality, however, I believe, and as has been expressed by other members of the community, extends beyond just the simple conversation of whether or not it's going to cost more out of the budget. The question of revenue neutrality also includes the question of whether or not we're going to be exposing ourselves to greater political risk that would come with the idea that creating a hybrid retirement system may open the door for future legislatures to add on benefits that would require funding and additional appropriations in the future. Over the course of our discussions on the hybrid retirement proposal, we did see a lot of requests coming through in the various roundtables of different alternatives to consider with respect to the hybrid plan. And those alternatives all came with additional cost estimates. And we saw these questions result in a cost estimate of between 28% total to the government of Guam all the way up to 35%. And it was in the course of these discussions that it became clear that if we adopt a hybrid retirement system as a standalone proposal, it will open the door for future legislatures to have to address the political pressures of various interest groups wanting to enhance, for whatever reason, the benefit schedules that the original hybrid proposal would offer. With the hybrid plan being entirely constructed from the government of Guam, that would basically make the case that it can be reconstructed by the government of Guam at any time in the future. And so as we sit back and we assess the question of revenue neutrality, we need to ask ourselves whether or not revenue neutrality in the strict sense of a budgetary appropriation is the appropriate way to approach the question, or do we approach revenue neutrality from the bigger picture question of can we afford it today and can we afford it tomorrow? The other question with regards to revenue neutrality is whether or not the funding streams that are going to be used for the plan are going to have any kind of adverse effect on the private sector. And the reason why this needs to be talked about is because if we increase the employee contribution rates dramatically, as much as 100%, which is what's being proposed in the hybrid plan, that is money that's being taken out of the pockets of our employees, and that's money that would have gone into consumption within our private sector. So by increasing the employee contribution rates in the hybrid plan, we will be decreasing by that same amount the level of consumption in our local economy. And so I don't think that that was necessarily factored into the question of revenue neutrality when the original hybrid proposal was being put forward. So we have those three different areas that that basically emerged themselves over the course of the evaluation of the original hybrid proposal. Was one, is it revenue neutral now? Two, is it revenue neutral in the future? And three, is it truly revenue neutral when you factor in the secondary effects of reducing consumer spending as it relates to our local economy? And so what we've tried to construct with Bill 266 is an approach that would address the big picture question of revenue neutrality. How do we go about adopting a retirement system that meets the objectives that are originally intended with the original Bill 2 that was proposed? And over the course of the discussions, it was determined that the original intent of Bill 2, the hybrid proposal, is to be able to provide a floor benefit to our government of Guam employees, a floor benefit that they currently do not have in the existing defined contribution plan. How do we go about now providing that floor benefit to those existing employees while at the same time containing the unfunded liability risk that we talked about earlier, and while at the same time addressing the question of whether or not, as a locally constructed, government-constructed retirement system, can it be reconstructed in the future based on political whims of the local government? We've seen, and history has shown us, that if we have a defined benefit plan that is entirely constructed based on the standards and parameters of the local government, and it's at the whims of the political realities of the time, those whims can easily overwhelm the fiscal realities that may be unprojected going forward. Case in point is our existing defined benefit plan, to which we already have a $1.2, $1.3 billion unfunded liability. At the time when those various benefits were being considered back in the late 80s, early 90s, that unfunded liability was on nobody's mind. Nobody saw that coming. And it was a snapshot in time where everybody thought that the good times are going to roll and continue rolling, and so they began bumping up the benefits for employees. What ended up happening was the good times didn't last forever. And now we have a $1.3 billion unfunded liability because we took a snapshot in time and we projected it into perpetuity, and it just didn't work out. So with Bill 266-33, what we are proposing in this bill is that we embrace the plan that was put forward by the Government of Guam Retirement Fund to have a hybrid retirement system, but limit it only to existing employees. So that way we can contain the unfunded liability risk going forward, and that way we don't keep it open-ended and have a situation that might come to bite us many, many years down the road. In limiting the hybrid plan to only existing employees, that leaves us with the question of what do we do about the new employees? And that also leaves the question of what do we do about Social Security, which is something that we've been talking about for quite a while in the discussions over the past year. And so for new employees, what we've decided to propose in Bill 266 is a separate plan for new employees that would mirror the benefits that would be afforded as if we had Social Security in place already. And the reason why we wanted to go that route was because ultimately we would like to see Social Security become the predominant floor benefit for our Government of Guam employees. And so if we're going to be creating a plan for new employees, we want to make sure that all new employees after a certain date are going to be afforded the same type of benefit schedule, whether it's something that the Government of Guam created or whether it's Social Security that the Government of Guam adopted. Another advantage for us creating a new plan that mirrors Social Security for new employees only is it gives us a third-party set of parameters that would be very difficult for us to go beyond if the political whims started knocking on the door asking for more bells and whistles. For example, if we adopt a Social Security mirror system for all of our new employees and a bunch of employees came in saying they wanted to bump up a benefit in one area or another or for one group or another, we can easily go back and make a case that this is not consistent with what Social Security is offering, and so we're not going to be able to expand the program in that way. By having a mirror program for us to be able to check and balance our decisions with, it really would provide for us a Chinese wall, so to speak, that we would have a difficult time breaching without having to answer a lot of very hard questions from our community. So in a nutshell, Bill 266-33 would embrace the hybrid proposal, but it would lower the employee contribution rates from 9.5%, which was originally proposed by the retirement fund, down to 6.2%. So the out-of-pocket cost also would be 50% lower for the employees as opposed to what the original hybrid was proposing. So we have uniform contribution rates at 6.2% in the hybrid, 6.2% in the Guam retirement system that mirrors Social Security, and eventually 6.2% in Social Security when we do finally adopt it. So while we are talking about potentially 3 different types of plans now and into the future, we are talking about the exact same contribution rates. The only difference will be how those contribution rates are applied to the benefit schedules of the employees. And the only difference in how those benefit schedules are applied are really the difference between the hybrid and Social Security. So I know, Mr. Chairman, that there have been some feedback with respect to Bill 266, namely the question as to why why we are talking about creating 2 separate plans as opposed to just one. Excuse me for a second. And the rationale, Mr. Chairman, is that we acknowledge the hard work of the committee and the retirement fund with respect to what the hybrid proposal is intending to achieve. We acknowledge some of the concerns that were raised by the private sector and individual financial analysts who have rightfully so waved the flag that this could open up some political risks with respect to unfunded liabilities, so we seek to address that. And we seek to address the efforts of our Congresswoman as she tries to move us in a direction towards Social Security, which is something that this legislature has supported via resolution and something that I've been working on closely with her as well. So as we try to adopt the hybrid, the question becomes, do we just do that, or do we actually go in and fix the system for the immediate term, for the intermediate term, and for the long term? And if we're going to choose the latter, Bill 266 would basically put forward the various component parts for the committee to consider in a committee redraft that would perhaps merge Bill 2 and Bill 266 and components thereof, so that we can achieve retirement security for our current employees who choose a hybrid proposal, retirement security for our new employees who would have a mirror system that would match Social Security, and ultimately Social Security for our Government of Guam employees when it finally does become available. So I know it's very complex, Mr. Chairman. I know that the title was very long, and it is that way so that it can very clearly spell out what it's trying to do. But I believe that after we vet out the various component parts and we discuss the need for us to be able to not only think about today but think about tomorrow, and we discuss the concerns of how we're going to go about paying for this in a way that's not going to cost taxpayers more money up front and more money later, this will try to provide all the different component parts for us to achieve that. So I'm really grateful for the committee and all the hard work that you've put in, Mr. Chairman, in the various roundtable discussions that we've had to kind of get us to this point. I'm grateful to the Retirement Fund for all the different analysis that they've done with respect to the questions brought forward not only by myself but also other members of the community. And it's because of everybody's contributions that we are kind of at this point where we're going to begin evaluating how we can begin melding the different concerns into ultimately a single package that we're going to be able to all more or less agree upon and move forward. My biggest concern at this juncture, Mr. Chairman, is that in light of this, the various concerns that were brought forward over the last several months, is that really if either party to the discussions really digs their heels in and insists on doing it any single way, we're going to have a gridlock that's not going to be beneficial to any member of the community. At the same time, too, we're going to have to acknowledge that if we're going to compromise, it's going to have to be everybody kind of compromising and everybody coming to terms with the fact that while no one's getting 100%, the real winner at the end of the day is going to be the stakeholders who we all serve, which are the members of the retirement fund and the taxpayers who are going to be paying for their employee retirement plan. And in the end, if those two groups are the winners in all of this, then all the work that we've put in and all the time that we've committed would have been worth it. So I'm grateful that you've enabled me to be a part of this process. I'm grateful that you've expedited this hearing, and I look forward to the testimony that we received today and the dialogue that we hopefully can have to try and get us to this middle ground that we've all been talking about. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator. I'd like to acknowledge my colleagues who have joined us. On the very far left is the Speaker of the Guam Legislature, Speaker Wampat. Next to her is Senator Rodriguez, Senator Morrison, Senator Camacho Torres, and to your right, Senator Nicolas, is Senator Uggan, Senator Tom Ada, and Senator James Espaldon. I noted that the Retirement Board didn't sign in, but I will do them after. I think I'd like to hear, I'm very grateful that the administration sent down a representative for this hearing. So I would like to, we'll just take it then from the sign-up sheet. Mr. David John, Ms. Christine Boleto, and Your Honor, why don't we include you up here? And Ms. Kathy Castro from the Chamber. The reason why I'm doing that is because when they signed up, they did something that I'd never seen before. They didn't mark the box support or oppose. They put an X in the middle of the line between the two of them. So
Stay on the job.
I just copied them. I said, oh, is this a choice? Let's see what the choice is.
So since that's a choice that I hadn't seen before, I will hear from them first so I understand what that means. Christine.
Half a day, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. Let's turn it on.
It's your first day.
She's having technical problems today. Her phone won't work. We may hold
No
it right.
internet, no nothing. Am I good? Okay. Day, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. My name is Christine Belletu, and I'm the newly appointed Acting Director of Administration. Thank you for allowing me the opportunity to provide testimony on Bill 266-33. The administration acknowledges the need to address issues and challenges facing employees who are currently under the defined contributions plan. This bill is a good mechanism to help policymakers understand that there are several options as well as combinations of options that may be available to address the needs of DC members and to lessen, if not eliminate, an additional negative impact on the unfunded liability and the general fund. As the department that is responsible for providing funding for whatever measures that are adopted, it is imperative that due diligence be performed on all aspects of the proposed bill's provisions to include a clear understanding of the potential impact on the already burdened general fund. It should be noted that the administration is not opposed to a plan that sets a baseline at a minimum equivalent to the level of under Social Security. Section 3 mandates that new employees shall participate in Social Security. Section 5 references the passing of Bill 233, Hybrid Retirement Plan, which states that the hybrid system shall be the single retirement program for all new employees. This appears to contradict the proposed mandate of Section 3, which places new employees under the Social Security Plan. Additionally, Section 5 also reduces the employee's hybrid contribution to 6.2, which, as the Senator mentioned, was 9.5 under Bill 233. The government of Guam will have to pay the difference of 3.3, which will be an increase to the government of Guam unfunded liability. The bill later mentions that the Board of Trustees may extend the amortization of the accrued unfunded liability to cover this additional cost. This translates to an additional $100 million in the unfunded liability, as the hybrid plan will increase as a result of Gov Guam now having to cover the employee costs. Section 6 creates the Guam Retirement Security Plan for new employees beginning January 1st, 2017. This is the cash balance, which seems to be a DB plan. This plan will be the plan until Social Security is approved. Of note is that GASB 68, effective FY 2015, now places the unfunded liability on the general fund balance sheet and increases its liabilities by 1.4, so 100,000 more than you had mentioned, Senator. Based on the foregoing, it would be prudent for the government to review a cost impact analysis, which I understand is being prepared by GGRF. The analysis, coupled with a risk analysis, will provide some of the basic information necessary to determine the merits of any plan proposed, seeking to ensure that employees' concerns are addressed while weighing any potential burden on the general fund and any increase to the current $1.4 billion unfunded liability. We request that this committee provide some time for such an analysis to be conducted and reviewed by the appropriate parties. This can only help to avert the current situation faced by members of the DC plan, many who have lost tens of thousands of dollars of their retirement investment. We look forward to working with the committee to develop and refine provisions of Bill 266-33 that will address both the needs of the employees and the finances of the general fund, so that government services will continue to be enhanced and not reduced as a result of any major additional potential financial burden. I will be submitting written testimony. This was very roughly put together this morning, but I thank you for giving me the opportunity to provide testimony on it.
We thank you and we thank the administration for participating in this discussion. We've been waiting for the administration to chime in on its position on this, and we note the discrepancy between Bill 2 and Bill 266, and we also thank you for making mention of the fact that we're going to have to pick up that difference in the 6.2 and the 3.5, I mean 9.5, which is probably about 12 or 13 million annually. So, but it is something that's on the table, and we want to discuss that. And we'll wait for your final testimony, and please assure the administration that we will be allowing for some time to review the financial implications so that we can move forward with this. But we really do have to move post haste. I mean, we've been in this discussion for 15 months, and I can tell you the employees on this side of the room that have testified a couple of times are very adamant about the fact that they want to know what's going to happen to them. And so we don't have the luxury of waiting another year and a half, or worse, 20. So please expedite the review and make sure that we get some comments in here so that we can move ahead, and these employees know that we are trying to address their concerns. Okay?
Will do. Thank you,
But please
Mr.
thank
Chairman.
the governor, and thank you very much for, on your first day, attending a public hearing that is of vital importance to everybody, including the amount of money that you're going to have to be managing over the next couple of years. So
That's why I felt it
yeah.
imperative that I be here today. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. David John, please.
Microphone's working now. She's cursed today. Good afternoon, Chairman Cruz and members of the Committee on Appropriations and Adjudication. I'd put it in the middle because I am in support of it, the bill. I just have some caveats after talking to some of the stakeholders that I think need to get addressed. One of them, Christine shared. My name is David John. I'm president of the ASC Trust Corporation, and I'm currently vice chair of the Guam Economic Development Authority. I'm here to testify in a positive position as an individual citizen on Bill 26633. However, I believe my role as president of ASC and my role at GIDA puts me in a unique situation to understand retirement issues along with the finances of the overall, the territorial finances. So I'd like to try to tie these together. First, I'd like to sincerely thank Senator Mike St. Nicolas, Vice Speaker Cruz, former Senator Chris Duenas, Lena Guerrero, and Dave O'Brien from the Retirement Fund for working so diligently on this bill, keeping it in the forefront, because as the Vice Speaker pointed out, there's a number of people waiting to retire and something needs to be done. As we know by now, the government of Guam implemented a DC plan for its employees about 15 years ago in an attempt to shore up a defined benefit plan that ran the risk of bankrupting the territory. While the intentions of the change to the DC were good, the plan was underfunded from day one, and it's resulted in a lot of the individual employees in a situation where they're not going to be able to retire comfortably. And when I say comfortably, I'm saying that there's a lot of them that actually might not be able to afford housing and food. It's gotten to that point. The good news, I think everybody in the room today recognizes the issues, and I've been seeing the ball being moved forward, so I'm positive in that. I believe Bill 26633 is a step in the right direction for the following reasons. First, the bill's ultimate solution for the needs of the government of Guam employees is to create a DC and with a combination U.S. Social Security solution. I think this is a game changer for the big reason that right now we have a dual workforce. We have employees that are in the private sector, employees that are in the public sector, and for the ability to try to move back and forth for one of these employees, they're going to either have to give up benefits, or they're going to have to give up benefits. And so you put this wall between the private sector and the public sector. And we kind of think in the long term, everyone wants to work on the government side forever, and that's not always it. People want to be able to move back and forth. By not being able to go out and get people from the private sector to fill roles that are within the government, we're not getting necessarily the best person for the job sometimes. When we have people that are working 10, 15 years in the government, and they might have a better opportunity for their family in the private sector, there's a wall there. So by getting the Social Security in place, I think that's the biggest benefit of this whole thing. It's not something you can necessarily quantify, but I really believe it'll help grow the economy, and it'll be a big thing for the overall economy as we're growing it in Guam, and put us into more of a modern economy. Secondly, the bill recognizes the Social Security structure the government is pursuing. The way it's being done is going to require congressional approval. And that's because we're looking to do a carve-out. We're not looking to get all the employees that are working for the government into Social Security. We're looking at groups of employees, and in doing so, it requires a congressional approval or some legislation passed. This is something that's been done on numerous occasions for numerous municipalities across the country. It's nothing new. Social Security Administration is helping the Congresswoman's office to put it together. So I don't think that it's a question of, that it won't go through, but it might take some time. And so the bill addresses that with the cash balance plan. That program will help cover those employees, create a benefit similar to Social Security without taking a huge liability on for the government. Third, the bill recognizes that existing employees need help. Well, the hybrid solution proposed is, in reality, we need to keep this in our head. It's a traditional defined benefit plan with a 1% savings account. We need to be honest with the community on that. We're talking about putting the existing employees in a defined benefit plan. The bill limits the DB exposure to existing employees, which is good when we talk to the bond people on that one, but it is going to be a traditional defined benefit plan. While I'm testifying in support of this bill today, I have a couple of concerns I recommend addressing before we move forward. Before I address my concerns, I'd be remiss to not stress that we need to get this done and we need to get it right this time. Twice the government of Guam has attempted a social experiment with the retirement system. First with the defined benefit plan and second with the defined contribution plan. The DB experiment almost bankrupted the government, and the DC plan threatens to bankrupt individual families. We need to get it right this time. My concerns are as follows. First, the floor benefit on the hybrid defined benefit solution is different from the cash balance plan and the Social Security solutions. This is basically some discussions I've had with stakeholders, including the Chamber of Commerce. This creates disparities among the government and Guam workers, and under its current structure, it does not incentivize workers to move towards Social Security. I recommend restructuring the floor of the hybrid DB to fall in line with the cash balance plan or a negotiated floor that's similar to the cash balance plan. Secondly, while talking to members of the GGF board last week, I heard concerns regarding offering too many plans. As an administrator, I really get this. If there's a way to link the cash balance solution to the current DC plan to reduce administrative work and costs, this should be considered if possible. It's something that just came up on Friday, not to throw that at you, but I think that there might be a way to bridge those. I'd recommend that GGRF be allowed to look into options and report back to the legislature prior to going forward to the floor. Lastly, while I understand there are individuals out there that want to retire today, we cannot rush this legislation. We need to get the structure correct this time so that the government of Guam workers can retire without threatening the solvency of their territory, because basically creating a solution to existing employees and then bankrupting the territory for the grandchildren isn't solving anything. With this, I would recommend the following. Create a singular floor for each. So, it could be separate plans, but basically align the floor piece of it. Determine, if possible, to create a cash balance account within the DC structure so we only have one plan in that regard. And then complete a cost study, as I think everybody is putting out there. And I think that was going to be done. It wasn't in there. And once and only once I can get that done. When these are done, then the legislature should move forward with Bill 2633 into voting. Again, I'd like to thank the Senator, Mike St. Nicolas, the Vice Speaker, former Senator Chris Duenas, Leon Guerrero, and Dave O'Brien for all their efforts in moving this bill forward. And I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you, David. Your Honor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for another opportunity to come before the committee to talk on the solutions to defined contribution plan. I've had a limited opportunity to review the Bill 266-33, and because of some of the questions that it raises, like those to me, I wasn't able to say I support it, I wasn't able to say I oppose it. There are a lot of questions that still need to be answered with respect to its implementation. First of all, it's I think, like David had said earlier, and I don't know if he mentioned it with respect to the cash balance plan, but a cash balance plan is a defined benefit plan. It is a defined benefit plan because it's a guaranteed return on a hypothetical account, and the employer takes all the risk on whether the plan makes money or loses money. So in that sense, it's the same it's a defined benefit plan, just as what we have existing and just as what was proposed on the hybrid plan in Bill 2-33. Whether it's a good hybrid or a good defined benefit plan is based upon a lot of factors. I understand with respect to the floor benefits that are being proposed in terms of Social Security benefits or their equivalent. How that's going to be implemented, we don't know, because, for instance, if it's going to mirror Social Security, the requirement is 40 quarters. So how is that rollover going to affect? Is everybody going to get a quarter of credit for every quarter they've worked so that they can work towards the eligibility of 40 quarters? More important is the rate of return. What is the maximum rate of return, or how is the rate of return going to be defined on the cash balance plan? The maximum rate of return right now, I think, is 6% under the IRS rules, but there are strict rules on how you do that. And so in order to determine whether the plan is attractive for employees, they need to know what is the guaranteed rate of return that they will get as interest rate credits at the end of each year as a floor, and then any additional plans, what is the rules governing credits if the plan should do better than the guaranteed rate of return or the rate of return listed. So those are some of the questions that need to be answered, as well as purchases of annuity at the end of retirement. So you get a cash balance when you retire. What annuity tables are they using, or are they unknown? So if they're unknown, then you have no idea what annuity, if any, you're going to get at the end of your plan. You may have an idea of exactly how much your balance will be, but you don't know what that would get you because there's no defined annuity basis, whether they're using IRS tables or something else. So those are some of the problems, or not problems, but some of the questions that need to be answered before it can be determined whether the cash balance plan is appropriate or not, or whether the benefits provided under Bill, or proposed to be divided under Bill 2-33 are a better deal, or something more easily calculable so that people know what they're getting into. With respect to Social Security, again, some of the issues, I understand David's point about the flexibility of employees going back and forth between the government and the private sector, but that cannot happen until Congress, well, two things need to happen. Number one, Congress has to make Social Security accessible to Guam, which, may or may not happen. We understand Congresswoman, I think her name, Berdalio, I heard her, but anyway, she's attempting to get it done. But I think the harder sell, or the harder thing to accomplish, as hard as that is going to be whether or not Guam is going to get the exception with respect to its government employees so that it gets credit should they transfer. So we may be accumulating benefits under our hybrid plan, saying new employees, you're paying in 6.2, we're paying in 6.2, so you're like getting Social Security benefits. But remember, one of the key problems we had was the penalty, and what penalty happens when you move from the government, you accumulate quarters with the government versus quarters with private sector. Private sector, if you work there for 10 years and you work for 20 years with the government, guess what? You've not worked 30 years, you've only worked 10 years. And so when Social Security figures out your benefit, you have 10 years plus 20 zeros to average out your average income over the 30 years for purposes of defining your benefit. So unless you get Congress to also adopt an exception that allows government employees in our plan who are accumulating benefits that mirror Social Security to transfer those benefits when they move to private sector, you're not going to be able to have that. In the end, you'll just have benefits accrued in the government, which will be payable, and you have benefits accrued in the private sector, which will be payable. And that's kind of where you need to do. So those are some of the issues, I think with respect to the percentages that we talked about, and I don't recall what the exact number is when we did the amendments or when the proposed amendments were done to Bill 2-33, but certainly we were looking at about 11.5%, not including the mandatory 1% of the total contribution, and we had the employees doing 9.5% and the government doing 1.8%. But again, I think the employees understand that the reason the government is doing 1.8 is because it's paying for the unfunded liability that's created when if this plan is introduced. So as an employee, I understand. The government is really paying more than what I'm paying. It's just that it's not being accrued as a vested benefit. But what's vesting is the right to an annuity which is vested, and so that's what's vested. If I am credited tomorrow or on January 1st, 2017 with 18 years of government service, I have a vested a benefit for 18 years of service, even though I'm paying 9.5% of my income and the government's paying 1.8. So I think the employees would rather have that because that, in all honesty, is a better benefit to us. We're not as concerned about how the government pays its benefit. Perhaps, in 10 years, if it's determined that, okay, the defined or the unfunded liability has now been lowered to the point where the government can increase its percentage of this contribution or redefine the contribution, then that's fine. We can lower the employees' percentage and raise the government so it's defined differently for purposes of vesting. But for the most part, the employees would rather go ahead and pay the 9.5% or pay, the higher rate because they're getting the benefit in return. And they understand that the government is paying just as much, but it's not going in the column marked 1.8%. It's going in the column marked unfunded liability. And we all are in it together to get rid of that unfunded liability. I'm not quite sure it's a social experiment, but I think the reality is that it's a commitment that the government has to its workers, and it's a commitment any employer should have to its workers. So in that respect, I again thank the committee for its work. I still believe that Bill 2-33 offers the best bargain for the employees in terms of benefits. The other thing I wanted to mention about the Social Security mirroring is most of the private employees, and David can correct me if I'm wrong, but most of the private employment places also, in addition to Social Security, offer a matching for their employees for their 401ks, and some of them go mostly maybe up to 4%, some as high as 5%, some even higher. Right? I don't think it's not in this plan. In this plan, it's 6.2 per employee, and the government doesn't put in an additional 5%. So, Social Security, when it started, was one of 3 retirement plans that people were supposed to have. They were supposed to have a company pension, they were supposed to have Social Security, and then 401ks were introduced as the third, not as an alternative, but as a supplement. And so, we've kind of gone from having 1 to erasing 1 and 2 and just having 3, which was like the last one in. And so that's why we're in the position we're in, as David John correctly pointed out, and I think everybody agrees we're in that position. So again, I think that if Congress passes the Social Security that makes us a part of it, then the government can decide whether new employees can do that. But then if you're going to do that, don't forget you have to include the government matching 5% so that they can also accumulate a 401k, because otherwise at the end of the day, all they have is Social Security. And Social Security benefits, while again, don't get me wrong, it's better than what the majority of people have in their DC plan right now. It's a challenge to live on Social Security benefits. All those stories about grandma having, Skippies for dinner, and those are from people who are on Social Security, not on people who have nothing. Now, I agree again that the proposed changes are an improvement as to what exists, but the question is if you're going to improve on what exists, where do we go? Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much for your testimony. Just imagine what you would have been able to testify to if we had given you additional time. And I saw the public auditor come into the room. Would you like to testify, ma'am?
I think the judge, I'll just make a brief comment. I think Judge Briali has spoken really quite eloquently.
Well, get it on record so that...
Well, first of all, I want to thank the legislature again for considering and looking at different alternatives. But I think Judge Berdalia really spoke it very well about what is the cash balance plan, which is really another name for a defined benefit plan, just like the hybrid plan is another name for a defined benefit plan. Ideally, and again, ideally, what we should have is Social Security plus some kind of pension, plus some kind of savings, as what I remembered growing up. Now I'm a manumko, but what I remember growing is that this was a three-legged stool, and because it's a three-legged stool, whenever you cut off one of the legs, you're very unstable. All right, and this is really the situation we have today. We don't really know what will happen with Social Security. I think we're all positive that it probably we will eventually get there, and so that becomes an additional cost to the government, the matching employer contribution, as well as to the employee. But I think we all know that Social Security has benefited the vast majority of many employees in the U.S., and why shouldn't it benefit the government of Guam? What we have here is many states have a combination. There are states that only offer a defined benefit plan, and then there are other states that have both a defined benefit plan plus Social Security. As an example, Wisconsin is a state that offers both. Texas is a state that only offers the defined benefit plan. So again, the government of Guam is tasked with what alternative. We all know that the DC in its present form, without Social Security or without some kind of defined benefit plan, is not the way to go, because those employees are at jeopardy and will continue to be at jeopardy until we offer them some kind of either Social Security or defined benefit plan. I'm not in a position to comment on David's proposal until the retirement fund comes up with the numbers. We already do know what the numbers are for the proposed plan, which is what the retirement plan is offering. So the question becomes, when will we have the numbers to really decide which is the better alternative? I don't envy the legislature, because you are stuck between a rock and a hard place. We know we have to do something. The question is, what are we going to do? And I'll just leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So we can go, since we don't have to decide what to do.
No, you don't. You stay. Any of my colleagues have any questions of this panel?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a quick comment. I very much agree with the testimony from Judge Berdalia with respect to having a 401k component that should be included. That was discussed when we were drafting Bill 266. In fact, we discussed it with the committee chair. And the idea that's being tossed around right now, though it's not included in the bill, is rolling over the payment of as the unfunded liability gets paid down over the years, rolling over those savings into matching money for the 457G. But we did not include it in Bill 266 because we didn't, as you can see, the title was incredibly long. And so we did not want to create an entirely new component when there are already 3 different components here that is hard to digest as it is. But I am committed to working with the committee chair to try and figure out how we can roll over perhaps the savings that we accrue from paying down the unfunded liability into getting us to a match of at least 4 to 5%, whatever is consistent with the private sector. But I do appreciate the contribution.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, and with that in mind, I think what the committee kind of has to, and what has to be thought of is unfortunately, that's, the 5%. Ask employees to do a little bit longer than 5 years before they retire. So unfortunately, we understand, again, anything is better than what we have, because but what we really have is we really have the savings portion of the Social Security plus the savings. So you would almost, in essence, say, okay, whatever you have in your savings plan, that is your 401k, and we're going to give you, in addition to that, Social Security benefits that you would accumulate had you been putting in your 6.2, because we know you've been putting in your 5% matching. So it would almost be like we're a private sector employee, except we forgot the 6.2%, right?
Yeah, two things on that. One is I do agree that we need to have a 401k with that. I'm glad you pointed that out. I mean, I didn't put that in my testimony, but we've talked about that. But regarding the last comment, yeah, we've been putting in 5% for the employees, and the employees have been putting in 5%. But if you were to go back and give them that and then attach Social Security benefits to them, you'd have to collect 6.2% for them for 15 years, also along with the lost earnings. And then, so, I mean, I don't think anyone's up for that one. So something has to be done to take care of the group. In the structure here seems to be equitable if we can get it in line so that the floor is consistent. I mean, it's negotiated, but if it's just there's not a separate floor for the hybrid and a separate floor for the cash balance piece of it, so there's no incentive to go one way or the other. I think that's the concern. And yes, the cash balance plan is technically a defined benefit plan because there's liability with it, but the liability is on the investment earnings. It's not on the other pieces of it. So,
just to comment to that, though, because I do understand that perhaps where we may be viewing this thing as a sticking point is what is that floor benefit going to be? And for me, the logic is that I'm comfortable adopting the proposed hybrid for existing employees because a lot of them have already accrued so many years of service that they don't have the time luxury of being able to bump up a savings rate in a 457, whether there's a match or not, to get to an annuity plus a 457 to supplement their retirement. Going forward, if we do cash balance and the cash balance mirrors Social Security, and that's only for new employees, and they have the 457, and we roll over the pay down of the unfunded liability into a match up to 5%, then we build a sustainable plan that's Social Security or a mirror of it with a 401k component that's similar to the private sector. But to have the existing employees swallow a benefit that's just mirrors Social Security alone for the hybrid, they wouldn't be able to have those years to make up for it with their own savings if they had that luxury. So I think, and that's why, I mean, I know it's very complex for us to be looking at existing employees having one plan, new employees having another. But the reason why it makes sense is because the existing employees do not have the luxury of buying back the time. The new employees do have that luxury of being able to say, hey, you know what? We're going to have this different plan. It's going to mirror Social Security, but we do at least know what our floor is. Now let's go build our benefit on top of that. So I know that we're going to have perhaps a couple more discussions on this, but I really feel like it pushes us somewhere towards the middle, being able to consider these various components as we put them forward. But that doesn't take away from any of the contributions of the testimonies today, and I really do appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Maybe you can explain to me, David, you talk about wanting to have the same floor for the three different groups?
The two
Floor benefits.
Yeah, I mean, the Social Security is going to dictate itself. But you may even want to bring the cash balance up a little bit for the same reasons that Senator pointed out. You're not going to have time for that group. But if the benefit for the hybrid DB is a lot higher than the cash balance piece of it, it disincentivizes people from looking to move over. They're going to tie into the hybrid, and then that's going to lock in the liability. As opposed to if the benefits are the same, some people that are on the fence are going to go, hey, I think I could get a better benefit out of this to go into a DC type environment and get my rate of return on that end of it, and I'll be better than the floor, and I'll have a better retirement for myself. But at least I have the floor, and by doing that, it won't create a liability on that piece of it. As opposed to if the benefit's higher over here, people are just going to jump over there to start with.
And I appreciated the fact that you also mentioned that the Social Security will define its own, or will come to its own. So we won't be able to get all three at the same floor.
Yeah, you won't, because everyone's moving and we're trying to catch up to it.
Yeah.
So I mean, there's going to have to be some assumptions put on that, right? Because we're not going to trigger every time they make, I would imagine, that would drive the retirement fund crazy. So some assumptions have to be made, definitely.
And that's the other part that I wanted to get on the record.
Yeah.
The fact that Social Security they have a cost of living adjustment, don't they?
Yep. Yeah, and you have to tie into those things. But the
And-
key
and
here,
depending
is
on those
sorry,
kinds
go
of
ahead.
things. So
yeah.
I'm just trying to figure out how you wanted us to get the three together.
You're going to have to build some
equal.
assumptions, right? I mean, that's without a doubt. But the one thing I kept hearing last week, some of the bond underwriter folks were in town for the signing of the waterworks, and they kept saying that we talked about this Friday. They kept saying the Guam story, the Guam story. Guam Waterworks bonds were 9 times oversubscribed last week. That's crazy. So I asked them, how much do you think of that is that Puerto Rico has been removed from the equation, and how much of that is that people like Guam? And they said, some of it had to do with Puerto Rico being removed from the equation, obviously, because there's less triple tax exempt pieces out there for funds to allocate their funds to. But he says most of that money's been reinvested, pulled out of Puerto Rico. Most of it had to do with they like the Guam story. And one part of the Guam story, a big piece of the Guam story, is what I'm not trying to kiss up, but what the legislature and the retirement fund has done to hold the ground on this unfunded liability on the DB. Yes, it's bad. In fact, it's really bad. And if you looked at Guam without really understanding the details, you would say, how the heck did Guam just get creditworthy rating on that bond? And the answer is that we have an unfunded liability on a DB plan at $1.4 billion, but there's a cover on it. And we don't have new employees coming into this that are putting pressure on that. And we don't have this unfunded liability that's growing. It's being controlled and it's being managed. And not a lot of jurisdictions around the country are doing this, staying the course on this. So it's a solid story. Now we start taking that off and opening it up to create a DB again. We need to be very careful. We've talked about
I understand,
this.
but
Yeah.
in all the previous hearings,
Yeah.
you guys kept saying creating another DB. All
Yeah.
three are DBs.
Yeah. What?
Be
Yeah.
really honest.
Yes.
The cash balance
Yes.
is a DB
I've said
plan,
that.
and just say it.
But it's the
And
difference
DC
is
and
just
the hybrid is a DB plan, and let's admit it.
yes,
Yes.
yes. So just understand is I agree. The difference between a traditional DB and a hybrid DB, which is the cash balance, is that it levels off the investment performance. That's what it's doing, right? It's taking when you have a 2008, the territory is going to be underwater for a period of time, and then it'll go up above that. It takes out the swings of a 401k plan. Is basically what it's doing. And so it allows for the overall fund to invest that money. So because it takes on liability, it's pegged as a defined benefit plan. It's really what they call a hybrid plan. When we first heard the term hybrid plan for what was being proposed by the retirement fund, that's what jumped into my head immediately.
But saying it was a hybrid plan was an admission that it was both. It wasn't DB, it wasn't DC, it was a combination of both, and including a 401 component or
1% that didn't end up in the computation.
But that it was still.
Yes.
But I think all of us have to be honest about
Yes.
that they are DB plans.
And this whole
I'm
idea
glad
of
that
not
it was
having a
actually
liability
his
is
honor
crazy.
and the
We're
public
going to have
honor.
a liability because these people they haven't had enough money put in their account. No matter what we do, there's no way. I had this discussion in I don't know how many times I've had this discussion with certain members of the community that have said, well, these people didn't put in enough money into the retirement accounts. That's their fault. Well, you know what? There's a moral obligation also. And in doing so, we're going to have some sort of a liability. It just gets back to what I'm saying is we need to be very, very careful if we're going to keep our bond ratings the way they are by how we open that can up and put the cover back on. So, I mean, that's all I'm saying.
And wouldn't all 266 and the two both lift the
yes,
lid
but you
on
know what the
this?
difference is if you can get it towards Social Security, if it's Social Security or Social Security plus 10% or whatever else, you can tell that story. I could say to you is, listen, I could be governor of Guam and go talk to the bond markets and say, listen, I understand we've just pulled on some new liability for our people here, but the plan before wasn't working. And everybody deserves at least Social Security. No one could very few people would disagree when I would would put that at them. No, or Social Security plus 10% or whatever it's negotiated to. But you can talk someone straight in the eye and say, listen, we need to do something minimum for our people, if not for the moral rights, which is what I believe in, economically. Because if you leave these people out to dangle, two things are going to happen to them. I think we're on the same page. I'm not lecturing you. You could lecture me on this one. But two things happen on that. One is these people go on public assistance, which we're paying for anyways. Or two, they go in and they're too proud to do that, or their family has some means. All of a sudden, the kids are having to take care of the parents, and then they don't have money for their own house. They don't have money to buy a new car. They don't have money to send Susie to college. And those are all going to cost the economy. So, I mean, you can have that discussion with the bondholder or anybody else and say, we need to do what everyone else is doing if someone makes a mistake, and that's Social Security. And then you could kind of come back to it and say, and these people didn't know any better for the last 10 years because it wasn't designed, so we're going to go a little bit off of the Social Security floor, but we tied it to Social Security somehow. I think that's a discussion I can have with you looking you in the eye. But when we start going through some of the crazy scenarios, this and that, and if it's the police department, it's this, and if it's that, it's this, and over here, let's change this benefit over here, and by the way, let's increase the benefit for, like was happened a couple of years ago, where we increased the benefits for dependents on plans down the road. Those are what every person looking at our liability is concerned with. And so that's the difference. If it's tied somehow to Social Security, the governor can look the people straight in the eye and say, we had to do at least that for our people. If you go a little bit above Social Security because people didn't have the time that the senator is talking about, again, we need to do a little bit better than that. We owe our people better than that. But to have something tied to just traditional defined benefit plans, it's a whole different discussion.
And what happens to 266 in the event that Social Security is not, and the exemption is not approved by Congress?
I think it would be a good plan on its own. In fact, I think if cash balance plans were more popular 15 years ago, that would have been the base plan. The problem is, you personally, Judge, is a point. Sorry, Judge. The point that the judge pointed out when he hit it is that we had, when we were structuring programs, you could do them DC, DB, whatever you're going to do, but really what you need to do is create a base plan that isn't something where people are grabbing money and doing loans and doing everything else. There's an annuity tied to it, whether it's a defined benefit plan or it's a defined contribution plan. Employees can't rob it as they're going along. They're robbing themselves, but they can't be taking money out. When when retirement hits, they get some sort of an annuitization process. And then on top of that, you have the savings and investment accounts and the 401ks and such. We took a 401k, or it was 403B, or 401A, I'm sorry. But we took the 401A, which allowed for loans and distributions and all this stuff, and we plugged it into the safe harbor plan, the safety plan. And so we treated a base plan like a savings and investment plan. Had we not done that, we wouldn't have been where we are right now. So there's a big difference in it.
And you also mentioned you wanted this ability to not have this wall between the private sector and the government.
I think that's the biggest one.
And can you explain to me how people are going to be able to take the money that they've put into this?
Oh, if Social Security, I was assuming Social Security. When I made that comment, basically I'm saying is when Social Security, we'll use if because you're right. There is a chance it doesn't go through or it doesn't come through the way we want it to. My comment there was assuming Social Security was in play. Cash balance on its own won't be much different from where it's at with the Social Security.
What's being negotiated with the Congresswoman and Congress and Social Security? Would that be for them to be able to accept the money that will be accumulating over and the quarters that are being accumulated?
That can be addressed straight with Social Security, is my understanding. I'm not the total expert on this, but I have had some dealings with it. We could go directly to Social Security and have us enrolled in a Social Security process through something called a Section 218 agreement, which is a negotiation between government entities. That could be done yesterday. The problem with that negotiation is it takes all employees into play. So it would take in a 63-year-old who was 2 years from retirement who's never going to benefit. We don't want to do that. So in order to create these carve-outs, we have to go through a congressional methodology. But it's been something that's been done over and over. When it was discussed, well, I'm talking to the guy who discussed it. I think if you talk to the senator when it was discussed, is they helped. put the bill together. So it's something that, when I say they, Social Security, it's been done over and over again. That's not something that should be a major concern. But we need to show from what I understand, is we need to show the Congresswoman that we're serious, that the community, that's what we want, and she'll go after it. But it could take some time. I just don't see that it won't go through, but it might take effort because it's going to be attached to a bill.
Yes, and in the news last week, she tried to put it onto the Puerto Rico bill.
Yeah.
But if it doesn't go through and say, we do adopt it,
Yeah.
and judging from other actions that we tried to get Congress to go, say it goes 10 years before it's done.
Then the cash balance plan would kick in. But my question, my analogy of having people bounce back and forth wouldn't be there yet. I mean,
that still wouldn't.
No, because it might be a little. I wouldn't thought it through. It might be a little bit better than a deep, but still, you'd have different benefit structures. I mean, so that wouldn't necessarily be a helpful thing.
And if after 10 years Congress does agree, would those people who have done 10 years with 40 quarters be able to?
No, I think, unless I'm mistaken, I heard a judge say that too. When you negotiated the terms, you determine which employees would benefit from it. So that's why you're carving it out. So if you looked at it and said, yeah, let's say it took 10 years and you carved it out and you said, okay, this is only going to be beneficial for employees who have been hired, say, 5 years and back, and the rest of them wouldn't come in. But that's where it's negotiated. And when they negotiate, they don't negotiate on individuals' names, they negotiate on seats. And the way it's negotiated is you say this seat is involved with it, this one's not. And then when the person's replaced into that seat, then the new person going into it's automatically in Social Security. So there is a protocol for it. It's been done over and over again. We're not asking Congress to do something that's never been done before. It's something that's been done a number of times since Social Security has been available to government agencies.
No, I understand that there may have been other times that this has been done. I'm just trying to figure out what happens to those people in the middle.
The cash balance plan would cover for them.
And that's the government of Guam's obligation.
Yes.
All the benefits that we promised them
Yes.
will be part of a unfunded liability at that time, or it'll be accruing between now and the time that they leave.
Yes.
With all the promises that we've made to them.
Yep. So my clear thing that I think is beneficial from this process is Social Security going forward. How we get to that piece, there's 9 different ways. I've talked about this, Senator St. Nicolas, and I've talked about this in nauseam. It really just comes down to is what's the floor we want to create for these employees. We could do it in a defined benefit plan. We could do it in a cash balance plan. You could do it in a combination that's being proposed. But really what the question is what should be the floor for this group of employees until, I've used the word until, that you realize you say if, Social Security comes into play.
If I could just contribute, Mr. Chairman, to the dialogue. And it's a very good dialogue because it really helps to flush out exactly why there's a 266 and a Bill 2. And for me, the question becomes, are we talking about not only a floor benefit, but what's the floor model of that benefit?
Exactly.
And that's why it's very concerning, just Bill 2 as a standalone, because that floor model is a tailored model to address the needs of a very unique group that had issues that needed to be taken care of, versus 266 and this cash balance floor model that's patterned after Social Security. Now, the difference between the two is the first floor model, the hybrid, is tailored specifically for a unique group of people that has unique needs. And my concern going forward is that unique groups and unique needs emerge all the time for political purposes. 10 years from now, we'll have a unique group that has a unique need that wants a unique plan. And if we have that as the open-ended plan for the government of Guam, then we run the risk of always going back in and tinkering for unique needs for unique groups. If we only have the hybrid for the existing employees for this unique group, and then going forward we have the cash balance that's modeled after Social Security, which basically gives it an arm's length separation so that basically if a unique group or a unique need emerges in the future, legislatures can look back at that group and say, it's not consistent with the original intent of what we've adopted with the cash balance plan modeling Social Security. And so it gives us, as I mentioned in my opening statement, that Chinese wall of protection against future political risk of of that particular defined benefit plan mushrooming into something else entirely based on the political flavors of the time. So that's why we're proposing having these two separate DB approaches to the existing problem. One is for the existing employees, like Judge Bordalio and everyone, and some of the other people here today, and the other is for the new employees who eventually and ultimately we do want to have under Social Security with the federal government. The big question that we really need to reconcile is what kind of unfunded liability risk do we really want to expose ourselves to, based on the floor model of the various DB components that we have out there. Do we want to expose ourselves to an unfunded liability risk that is born out of what the hybrid is born out of, which is a unique plan for a unique group and their unique needs? Or do we want it based after almost a third-party model that really gives us a greater degree of discipline to be able to say, hey, you know what, we cannot deviate too far from that example. And in incorporating both, I really believe that it provides for us the compromise necessary to address the unique needs and the unique circumstances of the existing employees with the hybrid, and then containing that, and rightfully so, because it was a disservice over the last 15 years, containing it, fixing it, and then making sure that we don't overexpose ourselves going forward. Now, with the new employees going under a cash balance system that mirrors Social Security, what that does is eventually when Social Security gets turned on, even if the government of Guam is still liable for those particular groups of people who were hired after the enactment of whatever it is we ultimately enact, at least there will be a general consistency between both classes of employees. Pre-Social Security and post-Social Security will still have the same floor benefit, versus adopting a hybrid for all employees, current and future, until Social Security gets turned on. Then we're going to have different benefit schedules for two different groups of employees. So that's really what we're discussing here in terms of the nature of the bill, and the dialogue is very, very valuable for the committee to consider.
Actually,
and
I think what you just said makes a lot of sense. I'd maybe share this with you. The only concern, my concerns are very slim. I mean, if we had to move forward with what's there to get it done, you wouldn't hear any arguing from me as long as it was affordable to the administration. We're close. The piece with that, though, is if someone's on the fence, here's how I mean, from my end of it, I would like to see it so that, because we looked at the original analysis, it was almost 2 years ago now, I think we realized is the majority of the people in the DC plan, as far as numbers of people, if we started funding this thing correctly going forward, would be okay at retirement. It's a group within that group that just no matter what we did, they're in a bad shape. And so if we have the hybrid plan over here with a certain benefit schedule and the cash balance with the lesser floor going into this, everyone's going to jump into this plan. I would like to see that those that are on the fence would be looking at the cash balance plan as the solution, and those that were fully funded would choose that option because their upside would be there. That's the only thing. But I agree with you. Is start coordinating it off. I mean, we're so close on this. We're I think slicing hairs now. I agree keeping it separate so that it is a unique group and they need to be looked out for, because this, you could take that whole hardline approach. People should have known better, but you know what? Unfortunately, not everyone knows better. We learn about all kinds of things in school, and retirement's not one of them. So there is a social responsibility. So I do agree with that. It's just that I'd like to see the design in such a way that if someone's on the fence, that they would consider jumping into the cash balance solution, because it's going to create less of a liability day one, as far as I see it, unless I'm missing something. That's the only thing. And so that would be kind of creating the benefit schedule, the floors that were similar.
Mr. Chairman, can I make?
Yes, please.
Yeah, I just want to make there's a couple of comments that I feel that I need to make. Number one, it's not so much if the employees knew better. Quite frankly, the government should have known better. The government was responsible for putting in this retirement plan, and it was a failure because it wasn't a retirement plan. So yes, the people should have known better, but what could the people have done? Even if they saved an additional 5%, they would have had their plan plus an additional 5%, because there would not have been any matching on the 5%. So it's not, I think the government has as much a part in it as the people. Number two, the hybrid plan or the numbers proposed under Bill 2-33, I'm sorry, in my opinion, it's a good plan and it's a valid plan. It's not a pie in the sky plan. It's a plan based on actuarial, which has a 12.4% funding. If we got rid of, and when we get rid of the unfunded liability, theoretically that plan will be sustainable forever at a contribution rate which would be incredibly attractive to both employees and employers. Imagine if the contribution rate was 7% for the employees and 7% for the employers, and you get those benefits that are in that plan. It's a very attractive plan, and it's a plan that obviously I would be in favor of. I think David hit it correctly. The issue with the plans isn't that the initial benefits were there. It was that, we talked about how, oh, don't worry, next month you can go and get a loan. And that's where I think we need to treat this plan like Social Security. The access to that plan should be the same access you get to Social Security. Unless you die before you're 62, you have no access. So your only access to that plan should be like Social Security when you die. Because this plan is there to protect everybody, not you, but the other half, the other partner. That's the government. The government is half the ownership of these plans because the government's putting in half the money. And that's the reality is you don't get access to Social Security until you die. And that should be the same thing for the retirement plan. And that's part and parcel. And I don't mean to make light of what Senator Nicolas said when he talked about there's a unique group with unique needs, but I think what really happened to the retirement fund was there was probably 21 and now 15 people who had unique needs, and all the benefits that were added on were not in response to some would say real needs, but were really more in can really be seen as more of to some extent additional benefits, and that's where the line has to be held. And even no matter what we pass or what you pass this year that's adopted, next year it can be changed. So that line still always has to be held. And like David said, I think maybe the investors are happy that the legislature and the government has shown the ability to hold the line so far. And again, I think the fixed benefits offered in 2-33, investors will also be able to calculate and see as a fixed benefit and a fixed return that they can rely on. But just like a cash balance, it's only as reliable as long as it's held the line by the legislature and the government. Thank you, Mr. Smith.
Thank you very much, Sean. Why don't we hear from some of the employees? And then I'm hoping that I hope the retirement fund doesn't mind that I'm putting them off, because I want them to hear all of the comments. And so if everybody would just, I think you might want to hear the employees, Ms. Bolito. Christine?
I'm sorry?
You might want to hear the employees. I think the administration might want to hear.
I've been in my office all day today for 10 minutes.
Adeline? Are there any employees who wish to speak besides Judge Verdalio? None? This whole side over here? No one wants to speak? I wanted to make sure. Okay. Why don't we hear from the retirement fund at this point, and if it takes us to 5, and then we'll wait and hear if there's any other employees that want to come in and testify. Anybody? Oh, you want to? Please. Please introduce yourself and then make your comment.
Yeah, my comment will be short.
Just make sure the light's on.
Oh, okay. Yeah, can you hear me? Yeah, okay. My comment will be short. My name is Charlie Morris. I am administrator for the Bureau of Nutrition Services at Department of Public Health and Social Services. Back in November, I think it was, when we had the public hearing here, I came on behalf of our agency and also on behalf of GURA to present testimony in favor of what was then 2-33. And, our I guess approach was that we're not a bunch of great economists. We just have long memories of what happened back in 1992 when the switch occurred, and and I've heard the comments toward the end saying that it was their choice and those kind of things. Just to present another perspective on that is that I think that at that point in time when the government presented it, it was not let's give a balanced view of both alternatives to see which side the employee will choose. I think the government embarked on a very hard sell at that point in time to sell the benefits of switching to defined contribution. They offered a $12,000 incentive of people to switch. They went around to the agencies. They were touting what was then a very successful stock market, trying to explain what was going on and look how much richer you'll be. And in fact, I looked at one of the papers. They were projecting at current value, and almost any projection favored switching to DC at the time because of what the market was doing. The other thing that for me personally, what didn't happen at that time, and I thought was very curious, is that during the period of time that we were given to make a decision to switch from one plan to the other, that we had to lock in at a certain time, and right after we locked in was when the government announced the availability of a deferred compensation plan, which would have served as a disincentive to people switching at that time. If we knew that we could actually put in over $20,000 a year of our salary, into deferred compensation, that would have been a big selling point on actually staying with the current defined benefits floor. So just to present that perspective, because I guess as employees, we don't see necessarily the cash balance end of it. We just look at the fairness end of it. How were we treated at the time? What was sold to us? We felt like we were taken advantage of at the time. And so I think that as we move forward, it's important that that be taken into consideration as well. That's basically all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for coming the last time and making the testimony on behalf of all those employees that you had your signatures on. So thank you.
Thank you.
Do anybody want to come up from the retirement fund or say anything, or should we just take the testimony as submitted? Well, you didn't sign in, but I'm going to invite you.
Yes, of course.
It's so nice to be back. I feel like we should have seats with our names on it now. So we're all become very good friends over the last several months. But,
yes.
Yeah.
Please.
Yes. So seriously, though, thank you. Thank you very much for continuing to keep this conversation going. I particularly want to acknowledge Senator Nicolas. I know you're pursuing Social Security as an effort to find retirement security for Guam employees, and it's not it's not an easy thing to do. So we appreciate that. And so over the last couple of days, we've looked at Bill 266 in consultation with our legal counsel, and we agreed to offer some technical commentary on it, just for the legislature's consideration as you look at the two bills, Bill 2 and 266. So as we went through the bill, what we saw, as Senator Nicolas pointed out, that we're looking at Social Security plus a 1% 457 Deferred Compensation Plan, and that would be available to all employees upon the availability of Social Security, all new employees at the time. Just a general concern about sufficiency, and I think we talked about that there, about the floor of Social Security. Since Social Security was intended to be a supplement for retirement income rather than to replace income, again, we'll always be concerned about whether or not that floor of Social Security plus 1% deferred comp is going to be sufficient for income security during retirement. We see in the bill that the DC, the defined contribution plus a 1% 457 deferred comp is going to be included. That increases our employee contributions from 5% to 6.2% for those that stay in the defined contribution plan, plus a 1% for 457 deferred comp. This is workable. Again, we would need to give the employees time, just as we would for the hybrid, just to prepare for a change and increase in their employee contributions. But again, with the defined contribution, our concern is going to be the floor benefits. And I think that's something that everybody today has talked about, is what's going to be the floor, where will they have, what will be their basis of security throughout their retirement years. The hybrid, as we see it in Bill 266, reduces the employee contribution from 9.5 to 6.2, again to mirror Social Security, and it includes the 1% for 457. Our suggestion might be, if the intent is to change the contribution rates for the hybrid, then rather than to do an amendment through this bill, just change Bill 2 in that language. It might be easier for language purposes and to keep it clean. We looked at the Guam Retirement Security Plan, and again, it's a new plan. It's an interim plan. It's supposed to be something that carries our employees. If the hybrid is for our existing employees, then the interim plan, the Guam Retirement Security Plan, would be before Social Security comes. It gives the board the authority to set up the plan. And for us, some of the comments that we came up with and that we discussed was, as a new system, it's going to require a new process for the fund. It will take time. It will take money. And while the bill does authorize the board to borrow money, to take out loans, including borrowing from the trust fund, we don't believe that borrowing from the trust fund would be a prudent measure. It would not be within our fiduciary responsibility to borrow from the trust fund, particularly during this current climate. Our current drawdowns are higher than the last year, where some government agencies, as we know, were missing contributions. So again, we always take all of those things into consideration when we look at the trust fund and what we do with that. In terms of eligibility, the Guam Retirement Security Plan would be, they talk about the provisions are for new employees, for existing employees, and re-employed employees. Just keeping in mind, for new employees, it's not quite clear how Social Security covered employees would be handled under the GRSP. So someone like me, I work for the private sector. If I was to come back into the government of Guam, it's not quite clear the way the bill's written where I would fit into, which plan I would go under. For existing employees, there is an open-ended window for election. We would suggest that we put a finite window. Keeping an open-ended window for employees to elect to move into a new plan, administratively that could be a difficult thing. For DB retirees and DC retirees who are reemployed, again, we would just need to be clear. The language just needs to be cleaned up in terms of how they'd be handled and what the intent is. One of the things that we noticed for DC retirees, there was a note about whoever's eligible for Social Security or OASDI, they would not necessarily need to go into these plans. So we don't know who those employees would be and which retirement plan they would fit into. So again, these are just some technical things that we thought we'd bring up. And of course, we're always available to assist with that language. And once we clarify what the intent of the coverage is. In terms of the DC rolling over to the 457, again, just some of the things that we want to caution against or about. The DC account balances include pre- and post-tax income or monies. So we just want to be sure with the 457 whether or not they can take all of the DC rollover. So some technical issues like that will need to be cleared up. And as was discussed by some of the folks before we sat up here, it's unclear what will happen to the DC members' years of creditable service if they roll over everything into the 457, how that will be treated. So again, just we want to make sure that we understand what the intent is so that the language clearly defines that. For employee and employer contributions, yep, we'll be happy to credit employee accounts upon the receipt of contributions. And for employer contributions, we certainly appreciate the preferred status among all of GovGuam's expenses, but we would ask that it be for any deficit, casual or otherwise. There was a reference to casual deficits, and we just would like to stay on the top of the list. In terms of the accrual of cash balance credits towards retirement, again, the benefit floor would be Social Security like. We'll just need to do the calculations. I think everybody talked about what's that really going to cost, and we have some concerns about the credit for prior services for DC balances that are transferred to the 457. Again, we'll just have to do the cost analysis before you all can make your decisions, right? You'll need to know what the costs are. For employees on active duty, the provisions in Bill 266 are consistent with existing statutes. Just a comment, though, that once Social Security becomes available, employees who are on leave without pay, they'll be treated differently. So that provision won't apply under Social Security. In terms of reamortization, there's a provision in Bill 266 that specifically authorizes the board to consider reamortization to pay for the increase in the government of Guam's contribution for the hybrid. And this is going to require serious consideration for the board, particularly in this difficult climate that we're in. As you know, we are missing some employer contributions that are significant. As a result, we've increased the drawdowns of the trust, from the trust fund. And when there's a tough market and lackluster performance, all of those things come together and affect the viability of the trust fund. And of course, as fiduciaries, our loyalties are to the plan and to the members. So any reamortization would require serious consideration for us. And again, that would all depend on what the costs are. So the last two things that are in the bill are rules and regs and the educational campaign. Just in terms of timing, for rules and regs, it specifies 90 days to promulgate. The AAA process is 90 days in and of itself, so we think 6 to 9 months is more realistic. Similarly, we know how complicated this issue is for the education plan. It's going to take a long time for us to be able to educate our employees, and some of our DC members have talked about how some of their education, they may not have gotten all the information that they thought was necessary. Again, we just want to make sure that we are providing an adequate education plan for all of our employees so they can consider their options when they make their choices. In conclusion, just to let you know that the board does appreciate the ongoing efforts. We think we've come a long way. We agree with all of you and with those that have spoken before that we're getting close to finding consensus. And I think the fact that we all agree that this problem needs to be addressed sooner than later is a good thing for all of us. If we accept the eventuality of Social Security, what we would suggest is rather than two plans in the interim, that we consider a single plan. If issues are the contribution rates, then we think that we can modify Bill 2 to satisfy the requirements, get the floor, address some of those things that have been raised by stakeholders. It just has to do with the administration of so many plans and creating a new process for a Social Security-like plan when that's not what we do. As always, we remain open to assist in any way, whether it's cost analysis, drafting the language. We appreciate always the invitation to come before you. Thank you.
We appreciate the fact that you're so willing to come before us and to have provided us with the analysis that you have in the past. In some of your discussion, you're talking about the election. I thought about something, and then I thought maybe I shouldn't ask it, but I'll ask it anyway. Mm-hmm. How about if we rewrite it so that everybody's automatically in the D, in the hybrid, and they have to make a conscious decision to elect to go out? But then when I listened to some of the employees talk about what happened when they were talked into going out, maybe I'm not sure whether or not that's a, but it just seemed to me, my concern is that some of the people that are in trouble now are the ones that didn't take an active role in their investments, and they might not well, they wouldn't actively opt in or out. I mean, if they're automatically in, they're in. But if you leave them there trying to figure out whether or not they go this way or that way, we're going to have to be chasing them down to which side of the fence are you going to sit on. So I don't know if you can just consider that. I don't know what your experience has been in the past. And so I just thought I'd throw that out. But after they talked, I thought, oh, maybe not.
And Vice Speaker, you're speaking.
It's better, and then let them elect out. Because then to elect out, they have to make a conscious decision why.
Yeah, and actually I was thinking about, I wanted it in blood, that they had it been advised and they know exactly what they're doing, and because I'm just all the current employees who are in the DC plan, they will automatically be placed into the new hybrid plan. Those that want to stay in the DC plan or will have to come in and say, I have stopped, I've thought about this, I've done my analysis, I've talked to a financial advisor, and hopefully it's a financial advisor that isn't at the retirement fund, so that they can't blame the retirement fund for that, but they've gone and they've made a serious effort in educating themselves and decided I would be better off if I stayed in the DC plan, and I'm willing to take my chances staying in the DC plan. But I want them, yeah, that's opt out. But I want them to make a real conscious and informed decision, and otherwise we're all together. And then, not that I'm trying to force everybody in, but I just thought if they're just kind of sitting there and they don't bother to go in, and unlike some of the employees who I heard the last time, I mean, almost on a weekly basis are going in on the website and seeing how much they have. I didn't, those kinds of.
The big issue with that would be when you move everybody out of a DC plan. Let's say you terminate the plan. You have to terminate all their investments. So if you're in a situation where the market is down, you are now forcing all these individuals to liquidate at a lower rate. So I'm not sure that forcing everyone into the hybrid and then having them opt back into DC and have to buy back is going to be a prudent act.
Okay, turn on your mic.
You could make it so that the election, if there was an opt-out, you wouldn't have to liquidate first. I mean, that wouldn't be
You would
impossible.
have to, because it's based upon, the hybrid is a DB plan now.
No, but I don't.
And it's based on creditable service, so how would you know the years of service being transferred over? And then you also have the disparity between those who have an actuarial value of their years of service under their actual years of service versus those that are over those with the years of service. So those are the considerations we would need to consider, and the legislature would need to consider if that was the route. I'm not saying it's impossible, but that's going to be a big issue.
Pretend I didn't ask. I just got a headache.
Well, inertia is a big thing. I mean, behavioral science, it's a very complex matter. We've been talking about this for the last, 15 months. So imagine our employees who are trying to pick up on what we're trying to figure out. So it's a difficult thing, and it's a valid question in terms of inertia and where people. Sometimes it's the easier route and not the right route. It's just
Yeah, I really think the opt-out provision can be worked out where you do it to a period certain. so that you have 90 days to decide to opt out, and if you don't, then 30 days after that deadline expires, everybody will be converted over. So those who did not won't have to be forced out and then forced back in. It's just you've had your period of review, that window has closed, and now you are going to be converted over. So
I think it's worth
yeah.
looking at.
And you know, there is a lot of value to opt-out provisions because it does create action. Sometimes the action isn't beneficial, but if there is an adequate education program in place, then we can really say that we've done our fiduciary duty. You know, so I think that's definitely something worth. I think the Vice Speaker's suggestion is definitely something worth considering with respect to the hybrid. It also would help, I think, right, based on the actuarial assumptions, it would help the actuarials come out more favorably in terms of the cost of the plan. So that's another thing to consider. Mr. Chairman, may I did have a couple items to discuss. From my vantage point, and please correct me if I'm wrong, it looks like our compromise has reached two key inflection points. The first is, what is the contribution rate going to be? And the second is, what is the benefit model going to be? I think right now we can come to consensus that for the existing employees, the benefit model is the hybrid. I'm comfortable. I think that, you know, I'm not going to speak for everybody up here, but for existing employees, the benefit model is the hybrid. So for new employees, the question becomes, what is an acceptable benefit model for everybody to consider? There's a proposal in Bill 266 that it's a benefit model that mirrors Social Security. There is testimony from the retirement fund, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, from the retirement fund that there are still questions that need to be vetted with respect to that particular benefit model, but it's not necessarily a door closed.
Correct.
Okay. My second question is on the contribution rates. The original proposal in Bill 2 is for a contribution rate of 9.5% from the employee on the DB side, and the proposal in Bill 266 is to lower that down to 6.2% and to have the difference financed through a reamortization of the unfunded liability. Now, in the testimony that I've heard, there's concern that reamortization would require borrowing from the trust, and there's concerns about doing that at this juncture. But I just wanted to kind of talk about how Bill 2 still would require a borrowing from the trust for the $104 million unfunded portion.
Well,
How would the $104 million unfunded portion be covered for the hybrid?
It's part of the contribution rate, Senator?
No, but for those
I think the
individuals-
borrowing from the trust, I think my understanding of the amortization is as the 104 million gets added to the 1.4 billion.
Right.
That's when the consideration of the extension of the amortization period comes in, based on some analysis of what the contribution rate might rise up to in order to meet it under the current amortization. So if you're going to amortize by 2031 and you bump the rate up to, say, 32%, that may just be unacceptable, you know, and the way to come back from that, excuse me, is to extend that amortization period a reasonable period. You know, I mean, there are other issues that have to be discussed, like, you know, what's a reasonable amortization period?
Right.
What are the markets doing? The things that Lena was discussing about a minute ago. But I don't think that's the borrowing from the trust. I think the liability from the trust just increases, and then the amortization covers that or not.
So for the hybrid, it would involve a reamortization.
For
No,
the hybrid,
no, sir.
not necessarily. But it depends again on what the legislature and the policy
No,
body
but the way
says.
it's written, the
Yes,
way it's written,
correct.
it does not require reamortization.
Correct.
The way Bill 2 was written, it did not require.
So the 104 million liability gets funded how?
Have to
through
be
the
out of the
contribution
contribution
rate.
rates.
But what about for those individuals who will retire before their contribution rates will make up for the difference in their annuity?
That's part of the unfunded liability. You are correct that there is the unfunded liability of
Right.
140 million.
And so that's where the increased government contribution will have
Correct.
to come into
Correct,
effect.
correct.
Right. And so what we're proposing is, instead of that being the case on the government side, we re-amortize the unfunded liability so that it's not the government, it's not the employee paying for it on the 9.5, the employee contribution goes down to 6.2. And that's what we're proposing in Bill 266.
Yes.
Yeah. And so for contribution rates, from what I'm understanding, is that 6.2 as a floor rate of contribution will have additional costs And the retirement fund the door is open for it to explore funding that through a reamortization.
For sure, we would talk about it.
Yeah, please. I would like some firm
I mean,
answers that
in
we know
terms of-
exactly where we stand.
But could I just say first, there's two things. One is when I referred to the loan, there's a provision for the startup of the new GRSP that said that there's going to be startup costs for a new plan. And it authorized the board to borrow monies, including from the trust fund. So my comment about not borrowing from the trust fund, that was to borrow funds for the startup of the new GRSP.
See, the way it was intended in the bill was for all costs to be factored into a reamortization schedule.
Okay, so that it
Right.
might have just been our reading of the bill
Okay.
the way it was.
Right. So instead of payoff being within where are we at now? 16 years.
2031, I believe.
Yeah. So we're at 16 years. So instead of the reamort being at 16 years, it'll probably be at 19 to 20, depending. So that in that 19 to 20 year reamortization period, that's where we will capitalize the reduction in the contribution rate from 9.5 down to 6.2, and that's where we'll capitalize the costs of establishing the GRSP, the Guam Retirement Security Plan, as proposed in 266. And again, this is all just for consideration.
Right.
So what I was going to say is we'll look at those numbers to see how they come out. But the borrowing from the retirement fund works like this. Currently, the fund withdraws from corporates every year to the tune of $50 or so million in order to cover pension benefits. And that's in addition to the 28 or 29% contribution rate. So if the contribution rate is reduced because we've extended the amortization, what happens is that the borrowing becomes more. In other words, we have to find somewhere to make up that difference in order to make benefit payments. So instead of the 50 or so million that we're currently pulling down from the principal, it'll become something in the neighborhood of 60 or 70 million. The danger of that is what we're espousing. The danger of doing that is if the market makes another serious correction. So right now we're underfunded by half, right? We have a security ratio of about 50%. If we start amortizing principal even more and keeping in mind that it's a closed fund, so the contributions coming in aren't as large as they were because there are less people contributing to the defined benefit plan. What happens is that if there's a serious market correction, it could reduce the principal even more to the point where there is no return in the market that's going to make up for that drop in principal. And so we can spiral downward, which is not unheard of. I mean, it's what happened to several jurisdictions, some of close proximity. So that's the danger of the reamortization. Now, that's not to say that no reamortization, that every reamortization is the same. We'll look at the numbers and see where they fit. But the danger exists, and it exists more because of the fact that we are underfunded as much as we are.
And so the funding realities, we're faced with three scenarios. Either one, we consider funding it through reamortization. Two, we fund it through additional money coming out of the taxpayer through appropriations from the general fund. Or three, we fund it from out of the employee's pocket with their increased employee contribution rates, which is the original proposal in Bill 2. Now, and I guess the job we have is to assess all the different risk profiles that come with those three options. The easiest one for us to assess is option 2, which is funding it from the general fund. We're basically talking about committing tax dollars that we don't already have. The initial option of reamortization, there is market risk that's associated with that. It's difficult to predict what that market risk will look like when we finally, if that is adopted and when that trigger is finally pulled, because we could be up, we could be down, we don't know. And then the final option, the risk of it coming out of the employee pocket, is the impact not only to the employee household but also to the local economy with the reduction in that purchasing power from our government and Guam employees. So in all three scenarios, we do have an element of risk. The question becomes which element is the more risky. But no matter what we do, no matter what we decide in terms of funding, in terms of the item 2, the contribution rate, no matter what we do on the contribution rate side, there is going to be an element of risk and a degree of impact.
Here's another, I'm sorry, just real quickly. Here's another point with regard to the contribution rate and the reamortization. If, again, under a case where we have a market correction, the contribution rate is calculated annually. right? So we come to the legislature with a new contribution rate based on a date certain when the unfunded liability is going to get paid off. If this year we re-amortize it and we have a market correction, it is not, well, I should say, it's very likely that that contribution rate is going to go up in order for us to catch up. So any savings that we have isn't long-lived. It could very well be only for 1 year. And so we could have the contribution rate go back up, which is something that we experienced back in 2008. Now, we do some actuarial smoothing so that the impact isn't as great as it should have been. But that smoothing only takes a loss of 1 year, spreads it over 3 years. The impact is still the same to contribution rate.
But basically then what I'm hearing is that if we did do a reamortization and the markets did go down, the cost of that reamortization could be absorbed, will have to be absorbed by an increase in the contribution rate from the government, right? And so for me, what I'm looking at then is that the option of reamortizing provides two safety valves in terms of cost. One is we may have market appreciation, but if there isn't, we still have an increase in government contribution, which would have been what we would have done anyway if we had funded this through appropriation.
Well, it's leverage, right? So whatever impact there is, leverage only increases that impact. So if there's a down market, then the leverage is going to exacerbate that down market. If there's an up market, then we won't benefit from that up market because we've pulled down funds we've taken money out of the market and used it to pay benefits. So it's only downside risk that happens in the case of, true, your contribution rate reduces, but there's more downside risk and really no upside risk from the standpoint of the fund.
But even, let's hypothetically assume we did not reamortize and we
Okay.
just increased the government contribution rate. That downside risk would still exist because
But
if the markets did go down, we would still have to offset with an increased contribution rate.
Yeah, but it would go to but we would pay it off on a sooner basis. But you're right, the downside risk exists whenever there is whether there's a downside market. What doesn't exist in that scenario though is the potential for a downward spiral caused by smaller contributions coming in the way of a contribution rate.
And one of the things we really, and the board really needs to consider is the current situation, the cash situation. So here we're talking about returns for future benefit payments, but we're talking about where does the fund get the current cash? Because if government agencies are not paying to the tune of millions of dollars, the fund is having to draw down. And if the fund is having to draw down on corpus, that money is not being invested for whatever the rate ends up being in the year. So you add that to a lackluster stock market, to extending the amortization period in hopes of reducing the contribution rate, which you may or may not get, because they're still having to draw down on contributions. So when the fund looks at the three options that you mentioned, Senator, the fund's fiduciary role is the reamortization period. The other second contribution is the general fund. That's really on your plate, right? And then the next one is the employee's plate. You've heard some testimony today that they don't mind the 9.5. That's neither here nor there. But when it comes to the board has to look at what's on their plate. And what's on their plate is the potential if the reamortization scenario falls through.
But I would think that the fiduciary duty would be to the members and their schedule of benefits.
It is.
Right. And so if we're going to be providing a schedule of benefits to members and making them pay for it, you're basically, as a fiduciary, telling your client to just put in more of their own money.
But that's what everyone American does, is to put money away to save for a future benefit.
Right.
So
But-
we're not asking them to do anything.
But as fiduciaries, you have a fiduciary duty to the existing members
Correct.
and to the future members. And so if the existing members' contribution rates go up, and that's also to partly capitalize the unfunded liability that they have to pay for, the new members will also have contribution rates that go up, but they are not benefiting from that unfunded liability.
They are, because they're getting the increased benefit of the hybrid and the floor benefit that they weren't getting from the reduced benefit.
No, because some employees are underfunded under the current plan.
I know, but it doesn't matter.
And
That-
members
we're
don't
looking at-
pay for the unfunded liability.
Right.
That's a government contribution. So members members aren't paying for the unfunded liability.
Yeah, but what's happening in Bill 2 is that the government contribution is going up to pay for that, and the employee contribution rate is going up because the government side is coming down on their direct
The government
account
is
balance.
changing the scheme, right?
Right.
So the government is changing from a defined contribution plan
Right.
to say that this is what we're going to contribute, and how it ends up in the end is how it ends up in the end, to a point where it's now becoming a defined benefit plan, right?
Right.
Which we all agree with, which is to say that this is the benefit at the end. The government will take care of all the risk. So
Right.
it's changing its cost, but it's also transferring the risk. You know, the government's assuming risk, longevity risk for employees now, which it currently doesn't have.
Right.
So it is a better plan from the standpoint of the employee. It's slightly more expensive for sure, but in exchange for that additional expense on the way and on part of the employee, it's benefiting from a much better payout, a much better benefit. So, and the government, the 1.8 that we keep referring to is the normal cost of running that plan. So it's not a contribution as you would define a contribution to a DC plan. It's simply the normal cost to run that plan.
So under Bill 2, the 9.5 is the employee contribution. The 1.8 is the cost to operate the plan.
That's correct.
And the additional on top of that is the cost of the unfunded actuarially accrued liability of the hybrid.
Shared among the entire, you know,
Right.
that's as a government cost, right?
But-
It's a government cost that's spread out through payroll. You're correct.
Right. But the employees who are particularly benefiting from that unfunded actuarially accrued liability are the existing employees, because new employees are not benefiting from that unfunded actuarially accrued liability.
Those that are benefiting, those that have benefit from the unfunded liability is nothing more than having a benefit now and saying I'll pay for it over the next, in this case 30 years, now 15 or so years. So every retiree and current employee who is going to benefit from the current government plan is a beneficiary of what is now the unfunded liability. Yes.
So what I'm getting at is that as a fiduciary, my concern is that fiduciarily we are going to be provisioning for those existing employees who will benefit from having the government pay for that unfunded actuarially accrued liability. But for new employees who aren't contributing to that liability, the government isn't going to be contributing to their particular benefit. It's going to be their 9.5 plus, as you stated, the 1.8 operational cost of the plan.
I don't know if I understand that.
Anyway, I digress. So, what it looks like is that we have those two areas that we need to finally come to terms on, in terms of what is the contribution rate, how is it going to be funded, and what is the model that we're going to, the benefit model that we're going to use for new employees, because we've kind of come to terms that existing employees will have a hybrid benefit model. Okay, I know that it was testified earlier from Mr. John that they would probably like to consider the hybrid to have a cap to mirror Social Security, but I think over the course of the discussion today, we can kind of understand that those employees, I think, need actually a unique plan. But going forward for new employees, the question becomes what kind of a benefit model are we going to establish? And the reason why I'm proposing Social Security as a benefit model for those new employees is to give us a chicken coop fence, sort of, so to speak, in terms of what the benefits are going to be in the future, so that politicians have a more difficult time trying to juice those up in whatever election year it is. So that being said, is there anything else that we can talk about today?
A couple things, if you don't mind, Senator. One, I think that, before we give up on a floor for all, a Social Security floor for all, I think it'd be worthwhile to analyze that and look at it, because certainly the Social Security floor versus the hybrid, for example, the Bill 2 hybrid, certainly offers inflation indexing and other matters that, make it attractive in its own right. And so, I think what it comes down to is understanding both kind of the costs and benefits. You know, there are different benefits to the hybrid plan, which starts out higher but has no inflation indexing. Social Security plan starts out lower but has inflation indexing. And how do those benefits play out? I think that the second side is the cost. We pretty well understand, I think, the costs of the hybrid plan. There's just some assumptions you have to make as to who elects going into the hybrid. I think on the Social Security side, and meaning the Social Security is run by Gov Guam side, I think before we do an actuarial analysis and look at the costs, I think it'd be worthwhile for GGRF, our lawyers, the executive director, to get some clarification with your side of some of these open issues, so that when we see this actuarial analysis that everyone's calling for, we at least are in agreement on the assumptions that the actuary is looking at. Because as you know, given a varied set of assumptions, you can get all kinds of answers all over the place. So to me, I think those are the two things. Do we really understand the benefits of having a floor that's mirrored across the different classes? And number two, do we, can we get a handle on the costs, not only the contribution costs, but the ongoing costs of running these things? So that's my input.
Thank you very much. Alice? Okay. Any other employee wish to speak?
Thank you.
As I mentioned at the start of the hearing, the committee will continue to receive testimony. It sounds like we may need to meet again in the short round table after we get some actuarial but I think if the retirement fund representatives can speak with Senator Mike Nicolas's office about some of the finer details that you need to have looked at, and then we'll get together again and see where we are at that point. Okay, but I still want to keep moving this thing forward as much as possible. So let's continue to talk. And again, Ms. Beleto, welcome aboard. And we hope to see you more often, and the administration participate in the discussion, so that we understand what your concerns are, what the administration's concerns are, and whether or not you factored into the budget this additional $12 million to $13 million. So and how we're going to address that. But otherwise, I guess we stand adjourned.